Our next presentation is by my colleague Sonya. It's a pleasure for me to introduce Sonya, to have her at the conference. She's in the Department of Psychology and Communication Studies and also at the Research Center for Group Dynamics in the Institute for Social Research. She has an abiding interest in entertainment media and their impact, and she's going to be talking about that today in her presentation about health-related messages.
Thanks, Mike. Good morning, everybody. Let me just cue myself up here. Oopsie. Okay. So I'd like to first thank the organizing committee for the invitation and NSF for supporting the meeting. I know I've learned a lot here over the past 24 hours, and hopefully this will be somewhat interesting to the rest of you. I'm going to talk about work that actually started when I was in graduate school, so I'm going back a little bit in history, and I'm going to focus on incidental health messages. I'm not thrilled with this terminology, so if you can think of something better, please suggest. But what I'm trying to get at here is the exposure that people have to health and science, mostly health, messages in their everyday life as they sort of walk through the world, right? And in particular from entertainment media. So I'm going to focus on fictional accounts for the most part. But the overarching sort of idea is things that come from stories. So I want to thank Liz for setting me up so well in her talk yesterday. I don't have to talk about theory anymore because she pointed it out, and I'll probably reference that talk. Okay, so stories are a means of transmitting messages and influencing behavior. Okay, Plato, right, said that we should require poets to tell stories that have appropriate moral meanings, right? Parables are used in certain religious traditions to teach moral stories. And if we sort of fast forward to the dawn of the movie age, there was concern even back in the 30s that movies would corrupt young people. And no less than Leon Thurstone did studies on it. So I'm going to contend that movies actually provide information about prevalence, about acceptability, and about the function of a variety of behaviors in social life. And my example today is going to be sort of an illustrative case, but there's a lot of areas in which this has been done. Many of you are familiar with the media violence literature that argues that exposure to violent media prompts aggressive outcomes in viewers, but there's others. Peter asked the question yesterday, is it too early to talk about sex? Apparently it's not. Romance novel readers and condom use. There's a great study from the late 1990s looking at the themes in romance novels of that period, suggesting that romance novel readers were less likely to favor condom use because of a swept away myth that was prevalent in these stories at that time. And it was a beautiful study that started with a content analysis, showed a correlational relation between readers and condom use beliefs, and then did an experiment where they inserted a safer sex message within a romance novel passage and found effects on condom use positivity and negativity in readers that had been randomly assigned to read this safer sex message. There is some work that the CDC did where a soap opera storyline was placed with HIV, a really then nice outcome evaluation showing that calls to the National HIV hotline spiked in the time when that was aired. And they do this is a kind of standard technique, putting a PSA at the end of any kind of entertainment education message that refers people to source resources. I mean, the graph is outstanding. You don't have to. It was a public service announcement, which was basically the actor who had been portraying the person who had HIV saying, if you have questions, call the hotline. And then what I'm going to talk about today, which is substance use in movies and adolescent substance use. I'm going to flip back and forth between tobacco and alcohol, just because those are the data that I have. Alcohol content in coded movies. So I worked for several years and still do occasionally with some colleagues at Dartmouth College who have this movie study where they code all of the popular movies that come out in a given year, the top 100. It's a very systematic coding scheme. And what they have found, or what we found, was that most movies contain alcohol use. Right? This is broken down by Motion Picture Association of America rating. The blue bar indicates movies that are rated for children. G and PG movies, okay? So yeah, we're up above 50%. This is any alcohol use. As the depictions become more severe, perhaps, the prevalence rates go down a little bit. So anyone intoxicated is less common. And then we can actually look at it as what I refer to as brand appearances. Some people might call these product placements. I have no evidence that money changed hands. We'll call them brand appearances. Okay. And so what you can see is that brand appearances for alcohol are quite prevalent in PG-13 and R-rated movies. If you're curious which brands, Miller and Budweiser comprise the majority, the vast majority of those placements. Are kids exposed to it though, right? If this stuff is in movies, okay, it's in a lot of movies, we might expect that kids are exposed to it. They are, in fact. This is again broken down by rating. And also by ethnicity of the adolescent respondents in a survey. This is a nationally representative survey sample. And what you can see, right, is that exposure mostly comes from PG-13 movies. Why is that? Because they have, we'll go back a slide, just as much alcohol content, but they have a bigger adolescent audience. And you'll also maybe notice that our movie exposure is significantly higher for African American kids. And so this brings up questions of health disparity, disparity in exposure that might relate to disparity in outcomes. And that will be a little bit important later on in my story. So not only is there exposure, there's been several studies that have demonstrated a dose-response relation between exposure to alcohol depictions and alcohol use among kids. This is net confounding variables, and I'll show you the kinds of variables that we control for. Similar findings for smoking exposure. Okay, so how does this happen? I was interested in, as a psychologist, I'm interested in the ways in which exposure translates to behavior, right? What happens in between. So we had a survey, again, this one that produced the exposure estimates. It's nationally representative, random digit dial. There's 4 waves in this particular analysis. They were taken at 8-month intervals, 2000s, mid-2000s. The predictor of interest is exposure to depictions of alcohol use. This is an estimate of the minutes or seconds or hours of alcohol use that kids are seeing in movies. Lifetime. Some mediators that are based on health behavior models that are well established. One are prototypes of drinkers. So this is drinkers are smart, cool, funny, sexy, etc. Who are drinkers? What are they like? Expectancies about alcohol use. Alcohol will help me have more fun at parties. Alcohol will help me cope with issues, etc. Okay. Norms. So what's the prevalence of alcohol use? And friends' use of alcohol. So how many of your close friends drink? And then finally, intentions or willingness to drink. I work a lot with my collaborators, Meg Gerard and Rick Gibbons, who argue that willingness to use is a better predictor of behavior in adolescents than plans, right? Adolescents don't make plans to misbehave. They are willing to do it should the opportunity arise. So we have a willingness measure as the proximal predictor of behavior. And then finally, our criterion variable, which is frequency and quantity of drinking in the past month. Okay, so this controls for, because as you might be thinking, well, there's all sorts of things that predict whether kids will drink. We control for general exposure to media. So the number of movies they watch per week and the hours of television per day. And this is trying to get at a little bit the specificity of, like, is this just movie viewing or is this alcohol content viewing? We control for sociodemographics, age, gender, and parent education, child characteristics, self-esteem, rebelliousness, and sensation-seeking, all of which are associated with the outcomes. And then parental behavior, so parent drinking and parenting style. This is what you might think about as warmth and responsiveness. Okay, so covariates exist at all stages in the model. I'm going to show you 3 time points. Time 1 and time 2 are collapsed because that's the exposure measures. So we have general media use, we have movie alcohol exposure. We have consumption at time 4, 2 years later. We have all sorts of mediators in the middle, including consumption at wave 3, right? So what we're going to be looking at is increases in consumption over time. And we predict about 43 to 78% of the variance in the outcome variables. Okay, so consumption, how much you drink, guess what? Predicts your prototypes of drinkers and your expectancies of drinking, right? So when I ask you at time 3, how much have you drunk in the past 30 days? You give me an answer, and that actually predicts your prototypes at that same point in time. Not surprising, I'm sure, to anyone. It also predicts your willingness to use in the future. It predicts consumption 8 months later. The stability path is logical and sensible, right? Okay. Excuse me. This model, by the way, fits pretty well for those who are concerned about these things. There is a strong correlation between movie alcohol exposure and your general exposure to media, right? That makes sense because I just showed you that alcohol is everywhere in movies. Movie alcohol exposure predicts consumption 8 months later. It also predicts an increase in friends use. So this is change in friends use. So friend use at time 1 and 2 is controlled, right? And the more alcohol a kid sees in a movie, the more likely their friends are to drink. And we can talk about whether that's a shift in peer group or whether that's a change in the peer group's behavior during the question period. What was of particular interest to me, though, is do these exposures predict changes in cognitions, or do they predict cognitions? And the answer is yes, that they do, right? So you get more favorable prototypes, more favorable expectancies, and higher estimates of the number of kids your age who drink and have been drunk, controlling for what you know about your friends, the more alcohol exposure you see. Friend use predicts all of those things too, right? Friend use is super important. There's social influences. This is a social behavior. And prototypes and expectancies go on to predict a kid's willingness to use. Friend use does the same thing. You'll notice the influence of norms stops, right? And of course, willingness predicts consumption, right? So we have this nice fitting model that tells a story about the ways in which alcohol exposure or exposure to alcohol in movies goes on to change what people think about alcohol and then what they will then do. And friend use has a sort of residual direct effect on consumption. People are often curious. I'm taking out the non-significant indirect paths there, so all of those indirect paths that you're seeing are still significant. And if we clean up the diagram for just a minute, all of those paths are still there. I just want to make it a bit easier to see. When we look at general media use, what we actually get are negative correlations. So there's some suppression going on here where what we think it is once you've accounted for movie alcohol exposure, because that's so ubiquitous, everything else you get is kind of safe media at that point. But certainly no evidence that it's just media use. So we find, right, that more exposure to this alcohol use in movies is associated with more consumption, more pro-alcohol cognitions. It increases reports of friends' alcohol use, and you get these indirect effects through these pathways. So how does this happen? Well, this is what Liz set up so nicely for me yesterday. There's a long tradition of thinking about modeling in scripts. Okay, so you can go back to Bandura in the 1960s, who said, if you show people behavior and you show that behavior being rewarded or punished, people are going to change their own behavior. So that theory is somewhat supported in what's going on here. More recently, sort of script theory, right, that we understand what to do in different situations because we have scripts about how those situations are supposed to go, right? Every movie has a script, and those scripts can be used as information for what we should do. Transportation or engagement or convergent attention The notion that when you are sucked into one of these stories, right, that has persuasive power. Simulation. There's a set of work in cognitive psychology that talks about the ways in which simulating action, right, can lead to impressions of it being real, right? We simulate the actions that we hear about. I have some data from a neuropsych study I did that shows that for dependent smokers, seeing smoking in a movie actually cues or activates cue reactivity regions in the brain, craving centers, but it also activates motor areas associated with the contralateral hand. So the dominant smoking hand gets activated when smokers are watching smoking content. Identification with characters. I'll talk a little bit more about this. This notion that if you have a character and if you can walk a mile in their shoes, that this will influence you taking on the position that they've taken, or seeing that as more relevant to you. And then I think it's important to note how motivations play into a lot of this, right? So when you're watching a movie, you're not there necessarily, some of you might be, to dissect it, right? You're there to be entertained, you're there to accept it at face value. It's irritating when something in the story brings you out of that moment, right? And then there's evidence, my colleague Monique Ward in the psychology department has demonstrated that having a learning motive when engaging with media can enhance the effects of that media. So for example, young people who say that, yes, they use media to learn are more likely to report effects of media. And in her case, that's particularly related to body esteem. So informational utility matters. And I'm going to pick up on identification and informational utility. So there's a paradox in this literature. Black youth in the US have higher levels of exposure to risk images in media, right? I showed you an example of that earlier. But the relation between exposure and adverse outcomes that you see, that dose-response relation I was talking about, is among white youth. And it's typically attenuated or absent among Black youth. So what is going on? There's lots of speculative explanations that I won't get into. I'll tell you what I think is going on. Exposure to movie smoking predicts increased association between smoking and the self. My colleagues and I demonstrated this in an experimental study several years ago. But this is only true for characters or viewers who identify with the character, okay, and see him smoke. So you have to see him smoke and you have to identify with him for this to work. Identification involves positioning yourself as the character, right? So it relates to liking, similarity, desire to be like, but it's distinct from these at a theoretical level. Okay, most media personae are white. This is an empirical fact. Do Black viewers identify with them? Researchers have found that there's less attention, favorability, and recall among Black audiences for white content. Black children and teens prefer shows that feature Black casts. And there's little similarity among Black and white adolescents' television preferences. So is it the case that Black kids watch different movies than their peers? And if so, could the important exposures be those from Black-oriented media? Okay, so here's what we did. We looked to see what are the top movies among the Black kids in our national sample. These are the movies. And this is a top 10 list. And these are the movies for whites. And I mean, you don't have to read these too carefully to see that the viewership, right, so longer bars mean more viewership, among Black kids for the top movies among Black teens was really high. And that very few, relatively speaking, white kids have seen those movies. In fact, in the sample that we looked at, fully 30% of the white teens had never seen a single movie that was coded as Black-oriented. None. Look in contrast to the movies that were most popular among white teens, you actually see very similar viewing rates for Black teens of those movies, right? If you're not familiar with these movies, I have some examples here. This is the top in each: Barbershop and then Pirates of the Caribbean. Medea's Family Reunion and Meet the Fockers are both number 10. Okay, so it gives sort of a sense of the differences between in the content. And this is just a scatter plot of the correlation between Black and white viewership. So each dot is a movie, right? And what you can see is that there's a correlation. Popular movies are more popular among both groups, but you can also see this interesting difference in the variances, right? And so movies that are very popular among black teens, how popular they are among whites, it's unrelated to how popular they are among whites, right? So there's this asymmetry. Black and white teens, we document, right, have different viewing patterns, and black teens see most of what the white teens see, but black teens also see black-oriented content. And so are black-oriented movies perhaps more impactful or relevant, right, than mainstream movies among black teens? And could we be missing media effects because we use the wrong predictor? All right, so here's exposures. Respondent race is along the horizontal here, so there's our black respondents, and all of the other respondents in the sample are collapsed together in that case, right? And so what we see is this typical finding that exposure is higher among black kids. This is for mainstream movies. For black-oriented movies, it really demonstrates, right? So black kids are seeing much more content, smoking-wise, in black-oriented movies than are kids of other races. All right, so here's the money shot. So this is black teens. Probability of initiating smoking is along the vertical axis. Movie smoking exposure is along the bottom. Here's the effect for exposure to mainstream smoking among black teens. That's the paradox I was talking about. There's nothing there. This is not what the curve for white teens looks like. The curve for white teens is a nice curve that looks basically like this, which is exposure among black teens. Right? So, yes, I was right. There is evidence, right, that what we're seeing is a differential effect of content. And what explains that? I don't know. I don't have the empirical answer for that. My speculation is that this prospective relation, that was a prospective relation, by the way. It was 2 points in time. Between exposure and initiation among black youth has something to do with the psychological relevance of the exposure. Right? It's only in response to black-oriented movies. Because the correlations between those things are different, we can actually separate those mainstream versus black-oriented content out. And so if we have this sort of overarching model of exposures doing something to beliefs, doing something to behaviors, then there's maybe some kind of moderator in that first little bit, right? What gets you from exposures to beliefs? Maybe it's identification. Maybe it's informational utility. I'm not quite sure what that story is yet. But some concluding thoughts on what this all means. I think it's important to point out, as we think about what people are exposed to, that we got to get our measurement right, because we weren't getting our measurement right necessarily, particularly when we think about cultures or subcultures that may vary quite substantially in what they're seeing. And maybe there's something there when we think about political affiliation, right? I mean, that seems sort of obvious that people are watching different things. And so thinking about how we measure that well. I think entertainment is important. I think sometimes it doesn't get its due because we focus on serious communications like news or political speeches. I'm an attitudes researcher, and a lot of the attitudes literature looks at message content that nobody ever sees in real life, right? Mm-hmm. And so what are the effects of entertainment? What are the effects of stories? They're hard to study, but I think they're important. And finally, on intervention. I'm sorry, but I don't know what to do about this problem. I don't have an answer. There are media, as you've read in the white paper, there are media literacy campaigns that try to do these things. I'm very hard to convince about outcome effects, so I'm not sure if they work or not. And so I'd be actually quite interested in hearing everyone else's thoughts about, like, what do we do about this? Is this useful, or do we have to live with it and hope for the best? So I need to acknowledge support from the National Institutes of Health, the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, the Centre for Behavioural Research and Program Evaluation, from the National Cancer Institute of Canada. Yes, they make me say the whole thing. and my collaborators, Jeff Fong and Mark Zanna at the University of Waterloo, and then Jim Sargent, who's at Dartmouth, Meg Gerard and Rick Gibbons at UConn, now at UConn, Mike Stuhlmiller, who's up in Marquette, he's a fellow Michigander, and is now at Northern, and Thomas Wills and Kyla Worth as well. So thank you very much, and if you need to get a hold of me, this is me.
We're not going to see the video clip?
No, the audio issues. I could call up picture if you want to see some screenshots. There's some online.
All right. Yes, Nathan had his hand up first.
Is that me?
Yeah.
Adam.
I'm sorry.
I like the name Nathan. So I found your talk and your paper really interesting, but one thing that I sort of kept on coming back to me is that when people make decisions about what movies to see, typically, at least I think this is right, they talk about it in terms of like, oh, you know, I really like action films, or I really like dramas, or I really like comedies, or I really like this actor or that actor. And, you know, the alcohol content, and this is why actually, you know, the word incidental, like, makes sense in what you're talking about, you know, that's never part of the marketing material. It's not like I want to go see this movie because there's this drunk guy in it, kind of thing. And so I'm just sort of curious, you know, how like those kinds of categories in terms of how people typically seem to feed into the decision to see movies maps onto the kinds of content that you were seeing. And I know that like the any exposure, that would be like they all would have that, but I guess I was thinking more about sort of the other ones where there is intoxication or other sorts of depictions.
Okay, thank you for the question. And actually, it was interesting to hear you say, you know, the films aren't marketed on that premise, because that's actually been a critique from the industry to say, well, this is a spurious relation because what's happening is that people who are interested in smoking are going to see movies that have smoking in it, and you kind of go, nobody goes to see a movie like there's no trailer that has that. So I thank you for pointing that out because it allowed me to make that point. So I haven't actually written these data up because from a psychological perspective, it's sort of hard to see where they would find a home. There are differences at the genre level in amount of different kinds of content. So I probably shouldn't even say this because this was years ago that I actually looked at these charts. But my recollection is that action movies actually have relatively little drinking in them. There's no time. Whereas movies that are romantic comedies do. And there's an interesting story to tell, I think, there around a constellation of risk behaviors. So people's choices, I think, yeah, definitely come down to what do they like, right? They're an Adam Sandler fan, so they go see that. Or they're like action movies and they'd never go to a quote-unquote chick flick. Does the portrayal matter? Generally, the content analyses that people have done that are more sort of textual or descriptive suggest that pretty much use is taken for granted. It's pretty much depicted positively. It's used in kind of typical ways. So for smoking, for example, one of the things that you see a lot is that it's used to demonstrate anxiety or coping. Drinking is often used in combination of social situations. I mean, filmmakers are trying to depict quote unquote real life, right? And whether that actually reflects real life or not is debatable, but there's a script. The clip I was hoping to have been able to show you is one, it's from a teen movie. Any of you who are between probably like 25 and 40 might remember 10 Things I Hate About You with Heath Ledger. There's some nods around the room, yeah. And so there's this scene where he's at the side of the soccer pitch and he's watching a soccer game and he's sitting there smoking a cigarette, and this is on school grounds. This would never happen. At least, I don't know, at Canadian schools. Maybe you can tell me, maybe US high schools are more liberal on this.
Doesn't happen in Ann Arbor.
No, but, I mean, this is 1999, so granted it was a while ago, but he's sitting there and he's smoking on the side of the soccer pitch, and it's like, any smoking that happened among high schoolers when I was in high school was out on the street in front of the school because it wasn't allowed on school property, right? So it's not even realistic. And yet, in the moment when you're watching it, it's real, right? And this is, so because it's real within the context of the story, right? But that's the kind of thing that you see. So you see this high schooler smoking on school grounds. Later in the movie, you see a party where they are, I mean, you see teenagers acting as adults a lot in movies. And that's one of the stories, I think, to tell as well. And those movies are popular with kids.
Sarah?
Yeah, thanks for your talk. It was really, really interesting. I learned a lot. I wanted to ask you a little bit more about exposure measurement. It's always fun to talk about. Specifically, how the general approach you took to matching people to their alcohol-related content in movies, but also how you think about television exposure to the risk behavior content, and if you've ever looked at, or in futures, probably not when those studies were conducted because the plethora of media and tablets and watching movies everywhere and all the time hadn't really happened yet.
Yeah.
But I'm curious how you're thinking about the location of viewing with friends, multitasking, television in bedrooms versus not bedrooms, and all the kind of multiplicity of exposures, and how those might create different types of risks.
This is a great question. And the last part of it, the how do we understand it now with these multiple screens and multitasking, is one that comm scholars are really struggling with at the moment. And the answer is I don't know. I think we will probably have to come to the point where we are using tech and we are spying, right? I mean, we're doing what Nielsen is trying to do, I think. Josh and I could probably have a long conversation about this. And our new colleague, Jan, who's arriving from Belgium later this summer. But to answer the question about the specifics here, I mean, so I can't take any credit for the design of this. This was Jim Sargent and specifically for the exposure measure, Mike Beach at Dartmouth. Movies are nice because they're a self-contained entity. You don't have to worry about how many episodes someone has seen the way you do for TV, right? So that's sort of nice. So there's a self-contained entity. And what they did was, and this was in collaboration with Todd Heatherton, who's also at Dartmouth, was come up with a coding scheme that could allow independent trained coders to go through movies and check off if there was smoking and drinking and whatnot. So that happens sort of over here. Then in the survey, what you get is 50 titles that are randomly selected out of a larger pool of movie titles for each kid. So each kid gets a unique list, right? And then you can use the principles of survey sampling to extrapolate to a child's level of exposure to the entire population of movies that were, included in the list to be asked about. Those all have scores for how much smoking and drinking they have. Those two numbers get combined multiplicatively with the divisor anyway. And you can get sort of this lifetime estimate. So that's how we do it. So it's actually, the thing I love about it is it's a measure that is uncontaminated with noticing.
Right. Yeah. You're not recalling seeing.
Right. You're not being asked how much movie smoking do you see, which has all sorts of problems. What you're being asked is, did you see this title? And then we infer from that. Yeah.
Vish?
Yes, nicely done.
Thank you, Vish.
So two questions, since Mike is sensitive to making comments, right? So we want and ask but with preparatory remarks.
Please.
One is a fairly simple, straightforward one. I think maybe you're thinking of interventions in a very narrow way, but what do you think of Stan Glass's approach? Being very obnoxious and putting your findings out there in variety and shouting and screaming insults at the movie industry. The number of depictions are actually going down. So I'm just curious, why do we have to think of interventions at the individual level instead of more a social movement policy or a public approach?
I guess my answer is we don't have to think about them that way. I guess I think about them that way, and that's my bias as a media effects scholar, right? Someone who is trained in psychology. I think about the individual, right? I came to all of this interested in why do people not do what they claim they should be doing, right? Why do attitudes not line up with behavior? What do I want to say about Stan Glance's approach? I think it's interesting and important to have voices that represent a pretty broad spectrum of what could be possible, right? He challenges us to think about something that is for many people uncomfortable, right? That he himself doesn't raise the specter of censorship, but it ends up sort of being, it goes in that direction. I think about the tobacco control community in Canada years ago when I was there, and the idea that certain policies would be advanced and they would seem extremely extreme. And 15 years later, I'm seeing them enacted, right? And so those voices tend to shift where we think a reasonable intervention might be. And so I think there's some utility to that. I always think that policy intervention should have empirical evidence to support that they will work, so as to avoid the risk of backlash. But it's true. Smoking in movies has gone down. That's the empirical data. The content analysis that's been ongoing has shown that. Was it Glance's argumentation? Was it Glance's argumentation putting it on the agenda and people seeing the data? I don't know, but I think that there's space for those voices for sure. It's just not the approach that I would necessarily take personally.
Herschel?
Yeah, this actually follows from Fish's question, and this was great, and I learned a lot. So this is it's a speculative sort of intervention, a natural experiment brought to us by Hollywood called the Marvel Universe. So I kind of want to hear your thoughts on this. So we know that overall Hollywood revenues have gone down, but there's increasingly been like a winner-take-all dynamic, and that winner is the Marvel Universe. And you were saying earlier that action movies feature less drinking and smoking, and so if there's less money being spent on movies, but more of it's going to this set of movies that are like a bunch of action heroes who don't drink and smoke because they have to battle robots. Maybe like in the last 8 years or so, there's a happy story to tell, and Hollywood has done us a favor.
I think that this is a very interesting causal explanation for a decrease in smoking in movies. Which does not line up with the alternative explanation, which is that the advocacy has worked. So there's no evidence that drinking's going down.
Okay.
At least not until 2009. I mean, these are all sort of old, getting old now. There's no evidence that drinking's going down. If anything, it might be going up. They find ways. I mean, there's in the paper where we report the exposure amounts, we actually tie it to gross impressions in advertising, and it's on the order of like billions of gross impressions, right? And so, there's still, and you're seeing labels, so there's something going on. Yeah.
Nick?
Really love your work. You knew that already.
I knew that
I've told
already.
you this
Thank
before.
you.
There's just a clarification question. So
Okay.
the racial difference you find
Yeah.
is so interesting, and it occurs in other folks' work as well, where and you said the overall effects are very small for African Americans and bigger for white kids, right? And then you show the difference. You said in the talk there was a big effect. Is it just for smoking?
So the effects, how do I want to put this? When you look at quote unquote overall exposure, right? So when we use our metric, which is popular movies, which are mostly mainstream, because that's how they earn top dollars at the box office, or when you look at total TV time, or when you look at frequency of watching MTV, or like frequency type measures where where what you're actually probably indexing in the exposure measure is mainstream content, there's this attenuation.
I see.
Right.
So to square the circle then, the reason why you don't get that for African Americans is it's being washed out by all of this white smoking behavior or white drinking behavior in their exposure. And then you focus in your later work on when they look at just African Americans in these roles, and then you see the effect. Is that correct? Is that a correct interpretation?
Yes.
Okay,
If
good.
I understood your statement
yeah,
correctly.
I just wanted to make sure, because I
Well,
just want to
and,
make sure I
and,
understood
and Monique
your-
finds something very similar, right? That the effects of black-oriented content are different than the effects of other content on black youth.
Yeah.
Right? It's not just, I'm not the only one who's seen
Right,
this.
right.
Brendan?
So can I ask?
Oh,
Okay,
hi.
sorry. So can I ask the annoying experimental causality?
Yes, please.
Okay, please. We have to have it. In all
Yes, we do.
defense Talk, right? Okay. So with full recognition of all the difficulties of better measurement and better research design, could you give us like your account of how much we have to worry about residual confounding, right? So in my world of misperceptions, we have Fox News viewership correlating with misperceptions on lots of stuff, but it's very hard to disentangle to what extent that's people selecting into Fox News.
Yeah.
So all this stuff has to ride on these selection on observables assumptions that are very strong on there. And to take an example that's even closer to your domain, the violence in movies literature, right, had associations, but when, for instance, like the Della Vigna work looked at actual rates of crime when violent movies were out, they actually found that violent movies had a crime-reducing effect because people in peak crime age were actually watching movies and therefore did engage in other activities rather than potentially committing crime. Right? So I just want to push you a little bit on this issue, because my intuition in lots of other domains of political communication and health communication is we get big decay effects. So to get these very long-lasting effects on something where we have this residual confounding concern makes me uncomfortable. It doesn't mean I don't think that there's an effect here, but I wonder about magnitudes and persistence.
Yeah, I mean magnitude, right? I'm not gonna get into the media violence thing. I leave that to my very capable colleagues. I would say that the notion that people can be inside and therefore not committing crimes has some certain problematic from a cultural critique perspective, and I think some of those critiques have struck me as racist, quite frankly, but not necessarily the one you were referring to. But I've seen others that kind of try to make that point that movie exposure is okay because it means kids are not off on the street.
I'm not necessarily endorsing it.
No, I'm going to put my position out there on that one. But the bigger question, I think your question is absolutely valid. Like, what's the residual compound? Like, what's left over? The problem with experimental research of this type is that you are literally taking a teaspoon and trying to add it to a bathtub, right? If I bring participants into the lab and show them content like this, the effects are going to be short because they're priming effects, because it's a teaspoon into a bathtub of stuff that they're seeing, right? And I think we all who do media have the same issue. My colleagues have done the sensitivity analyses on the movie smoking and movie drinking effects, and I want to say, don't quote me, that if we go back to the paper, those analyses suggest that an unmeasured confounder would have to account for something like 15% of the variance.
Sorry, 50 or 15?
15, yeah. And I'm having what I actually think the number is, which is 30. It was big. I mean, it's persuasive. If you buy sensitivity analyses, then we're not missing something that's actually really important. What's a long-term effect, right? I think media effects are going to be cumulative effects, because kids are seeing so much of this stuff. And when you see it over and over again, at scale, that starts to get big. in our data, it doesn't seem to be as big as the effect of having friends who smoke and drink, but then kids see movies together. And so there's a possibility that it's even exacerbates it, right? You know, we have kids, right? You see them acting stuff out, right? They watch TV and then they go and they act it out. So I think that, yeah, these things are hard to measure. And yeah, there's residual confounding, probably, maybe. One of the things that might be helpful in this conversation is that when you actually look at the highest risk kids, they are the ones with the least movie effect. It's the lowest risk kids that tend to have the biggest. I mean, it makes sense, right? The highest risk kids are going to end up using regardless. It's the lower risk kids who have.
We have time for about 2 more points. We didn't meet yesterday, but you're Sarah.
Sarah.
Right.
I'm probably the only PR in the room, and I'm interested
Sarah.
very, very much in other forms of media and the way that they influence behavior. So I work, for example, for a group that is increasing healthcare professional capacity to help people quit smoking, and they don't specifically look at youth, but they'd be very, very interested in this research. And I guess for me, I would love to know whether you're planning any analyses of the impact of other kinds of news channels on behaviors like this. So online pop news, and increasingly we're seeing serious news really effectively written as entertainment because it needs to get its clickbait. So it's written in a different way, certainly the headlines are. And then because of that, you see channels like Vice News that are kind of aiming at this demographic, covering in more or less positive ways stuff like party drugs, e-cigarettes, very, very heavily. And social media channels. So I would love to learn more about the way that social media levels of reference of what we would call negative behavior influences actual youth behavior. And I think it's interesting to me in lots of ways, partly for the demographic reasons. So I'm thinking here of things like the Black Twitter hashtag, where you're seeing kind of a polarization of the audience on Twitter to some extent when certain topics are talked about. And then other things like hip hop references. So I was at a hip hop festival a couple of weeks ago, and I smelled more smoke of any variety than I've ever smelled in my life. And that demographic was totally mixed. So the source is being seen as coming from black culture, but the effect that it's having on youth of every color is massive.
There's a lot there.
Yeah, sorry.
That's okay. Let's see. So I agree with you, just at least anecdotal, like my own observations,
These are
not
just
systematic. That news is increasingly story-based, right? And so we might expect the same kinds of effects, though people know that news is news, and so maybe that gives them a slightly different orientation towards it. Empirical question. Yeah. I haven't looked at it in this context. I do have a recent paper that came out looking at celebrity news influences on bilateral mastectomy choices in surgery for treatment of breast cancer. So a colleague over in the med school who's a surgical oncologist they've noticed that women are coming into the clinic already decided on a course of treatment before consulting with the surgeon. And one of the questions was, could this have something to do with the way that these surgical options are talked about in the press? So we did some text mining of stories about celebrities who had breast cancer. And it predates Angelina Jolie, who didn't have breast cancer, by the way. And her decision is objectively, based on the risks, is a very sensible clinical decision. For a woman who's diagnosed with irregular garden variety breast cancer, that is not necessarily, that surgical choice is not going to improve her survival, right? And so there's other options that one could consider. And so what we see is that these things are talked about in different ways, and that the Christina Applegate is important, it seems. So I think there's space to ask those questions in this context too. So how are things being talked about online? There's a researcher by the name of Brian Primack who's been looking at these references in music. It is hard to know perhaps what some of the effects of that is. Some of Monique Ward's work has looked at MTV and music videos and finds some negative effects of those kinds of exposure, not necessarily on these outcomes, but on other health outcomes. Social media. Yeah, I mean, it's a social influence. I mean, we think about movies as a social influence, and so they are one of friends, social media, etc.
There are also movies of something that people spend a lot more time with, so that the increased frequency and decreased depth of the influence of something like social media, level of references to smoking would be of interest. I would love to learn more about that.
That's an interesting idea.
James?
I just had a couple of questions about the race effect, which is quite interesting, by the way.
Thank you, James.
So there are two things which are important in understanding what's going on here. First of all, the environment in which black kids grow up in has more exposure to alcohol and smoking than the environments that white kids grew up in. So there's more print advertisement, there's more billboards, there's more, and that's been well documented over the years. We know that a lot more. The second thing that's been well documented is that the rates of smoking and alcohol use among black adolescents is lower than that of white adolescents. And that's been true for a long time. I haven't looked at the data from this past year, but it was certainly true when you were collecting those particular data, and much lower, very significantly lower, even though the exposures in some ways are really higher. And so in that kind of backdrop, it becomes much more difficult maybe to understand something about the kind of media effects that we're talking about race. It creates certain kinds of difficulties in understanding that. Let alone the content issues.
Right.
There are some content issues.
Yeah.
Like counterexamples.
Yeah, I mean, this is a very, these data are pretty blunt, right? In the sense that even the smoking content is not richly described, right? And so it's literally, is this, and I asked black undergrads here at Michigan to tell me if these titles were black oriented or not. And so they made a decision about the movie. And then we just took how much smoking was in the movie. So not who was doing it, not what the context was. I mean, it's a blunt instrument. So I think it would be interesting to dive a little bit more deeply into the content issues that you're talking about. That paradox that you sort of pointed out, or apparent paradox that you pointed out, was really what motivated the whole analysis, actually, right? Because if you buy that movie exposure increases risk behavior, then it's hard to understand how a group that has higher exposure could actually be doing better. And the speculative explanations were not always ones that seemed appropriate to make. And I thought that one possibility would be this notion that it's just not relevant. And I have to credit my colleague Robin Coleman for sparking that idea in my head. And she said, well, black kids aren't watching those movies. And I said, huh? And she said, they don't care. They don't care about those movies. And I said, okay, let's see if that's borne out in the data. And it turns out it was. Yeah.
But there are other messages that are emphasized in black movies that you might want to think about. I was laughing when you put the movies up because the movies are very distinctly different with regard to what the themes and the core messages are. And a lot of the core messages in those white movies are specifically pretty silly. No, they don't reflect anything about life. And that's not an unimportant kind of issue in terms of how you think.
Yeah. Thank you, James.
Sorry.
Okay, as was our habit yesterday, we cheated on our break time. But first of all, I want to thank Sonya for a very interesting and stimulating presentation. And we're going to extend our break until 5 after 12. 11. And then we'll come back and we'll have the second session. So please join me in thanking Sonya.